Fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it.
Three of my friends and I drove to Breezewood as a staging ground for a nice nighttime tour of the abandoned PA Turnpike, a long underground tunnel that cuts through mountains. In the spirit of October, we decided to check it out late at night, so we set off from our hotel in Breezewood around 10:30 p.m. To get ourselves even more psyched up, I played creepy music along the way as we entered the dark forest. We arrived at the entrance of a trail that leads to a section of the Siling Hill Tunnel about 15 minutes later. For the next hour and a half, it was mostly chill. We walked to the tunnel entrance, explored a little side room, and overall messed around in the tunnel by laughing at all the funny graffiti and taking cursed videos. When we reached the end of the tunnel, we spent maybe 10 minutes looking around for a way up to the ventilation room. We couldn't find a path outside, and the staircase leading up was destroyed. We turned around to begin our long walk back, but within 5 minutes of backtracking, we noticed something when we all turned off our light in the tunnel. A faint, shining light behind us. Out of what seemed to be sheer instinct, two of my friends began running. More of a jog than a sprint. Me and the other friend kept up. Eventually, we all slowed down and made our lights as dim as possible. At first, I was unsure of why we're being so paranoid, but one of my friends later pointed out how it's better to not take any chances of encountering someone past midnight in such a secluded area. What added to our suspicion was how the people, we assumed it was at least two, behind us were not only pursuing us, we could tell they were running by how their light was bouncing, but how they occasionally called out into the darkness of the tunnel, and how they occasionally blacked out like we did. Our fast walk turned into full-blown sprint after we eventually heard a very loud, resonant metallic sound, like a huge gong being struck, which of course was amplified and reverberated by the tunnel's acoustics. Even while sprinting, I saw their light behind us, bouncing up and down, as if they too were running. We got out of the tunnel, shaken by what just happened, and reflected on how suspicious it was that they not only pursued us, but also turned off their lights from time to time. We were also confused about the source of what could only be described as a very loud gong. A friend jokingly brought up cultists, but I assumed they were just messing with some loose metal pipes. We all made it home safe with no sign of them pursuing us outside of the tunnel, but I'm glad we didn't take the chance of trying to encounter them face to face.
This happened during summer vacation when I was at school. Back then there was an abandoned hotel in our neighborhood. I invited two of my close friends to go urban exploring in the hotel one day. Let's call my friends A and B. We first tried the front door, but it was locked, so we went around the back and found that door open. It wasn't like we were on a dare or we were ghost hunting or anything like that. It just felt like a good day for exploring, and we were all free. As you might expect, the place was pretty trashed. We started in the lobby, looking around for anything interesting. Most of the rooms were locked, but we found a room on the 4th floor which was open, so we decided to make base there. In that room, the smell of dust and mold wasn't that overpowering. The bed was pretty gross though, so we pulled some chairs in from the lobby. Night crept in, and since there wasn't any electricity, we called it a night. But the next day we came back prepared. We all brought flashlights, and we headed to the hotel around lunchtime. We brought candles, snacks, and drinks too. We put all that stuff in our base room on the 4th floor and decided to check out the basement, as we hadn't done so the day before. The three of us descended into the basement with our flashlights in hand. The basement was huge. There were lots of rooms down there too. We were looking for a rope or something we could all hold to make sure we all stayed together and didn't get lost. It was so dark down there. I felt trapped down there. Even though it was lunchtime during summer, it was very creepy. My friends seemed to feel pretty carefree, so I tried my best to hide my apprehension. We then found another room. In this room there was a box. In the box, there were keys. We left the basement with the box of keys to see if they would work on any of the locked doors upstairs. The keys had room numbers on, but they wouldn't work on the doors that matched the number on the key. We couldn't work it out. Maybe there was some auto lock in place. We were just glad that the room on the 4th floor was open. We decided to look for a key which wasn't a guest room key. We found a key that said waiting room, written in pen. It was different from the other keys, and it didn't look too official. We noticed a locked door in the basement, which had a paper sign stating waiting room. So we decided to head back down there. We tried the key in the lock, and the door to the waiting room unlocked. The door opened a crack, and we were confronted by a terrible stench. We asked one another about what that smell could be. Was it something rotten or dead? I was really freaked out now, down there in the dark basement with this new terrible smell. I said, "Come on guys, let's go back." A asked, "What? Don't you want to know what it is?" "No man, this is dangerous, let's get out of here," I replied. B said, "Oh, come on, just hold your nose and we'll take a quick peek." A carelessly pushed the door open and shone his flashlight inside. The flashlight revealed a mannequin with what looked like blood all over its clothes. There were dead animals all over the room. Knives were stabbed into the mannequin. Shivering, A's flashlight scanned the room to reveal scratches in the walls and on the door. I felt my blood turn ice cold. I couldn't take any more. I ran, and my friends ran with me. We ran through the lobby and out the back door, and continued running up the street for about 100 meters. We were all clamoring, screaming and going crazy about what we had just witnessed. "Why were there so many dead animals?" A asked. "And the blood on the mannequin?" I exclaimed. B started to cry. We all went home. I couldn't leave the house for about 3 days. I was so freaked out. It was around this point I remembered that I had left my bag there. I didn't want to have someone find it and then find me. I was too scared to go back to the hotel by myself, so I called my friends again, and they reluctantly agreed to go with me. We approached the back door, fear weighing heavily in our hearts. I reached my shaking hand out and tried the door, but it was locked. This was about 8 years ago. I would often tremble in my bed at night when the lights were off, remembering that event. The hotel has now been renovated into retirement homes. I can still see the waiting room in my head. I think that whoever killed those animals and stabbed that mannequin so many times maybe was recreating a murder or acting out some sort of fantasy.
This is a true story about the underground tunnels in my town that me and my friends used to visit when we were kids. We heard stories about these tunnels, so we wanted to check them out for ourselves. So like I said, when we were kids, we used to visit these old underground tunnels that were built during World War I for the military. The tunnels were small, and only one person at a time could fit inside. You couldn't go by someone's side. Also, there was no light, so we needed to carry our own flashlights. It was really hard to coordinate inside the tunnels, so we used to carry chalk so that we could mark the direction that we were coming from and didn't get lost. The first 2 or 3 times that we went there, everything was normal, but we never went deep inside the tunnels, only like 100 meters or so. One day we planned to go deeper inside, so we made a plan and went inside. My friend Mark was the first in line, then my friend Alexander, then me, and the rest of the gang behind me. The guy who was last in line was marking our path and making sure we don't get lost. But soon enough, we got lost. We started panicking, and we were inside the tunnels for 3 hours. The strange thing is that it seemed like someone was erasing our marks on the walls. We needed an escape plan, so we just continued walking in the direction we thought was the way we came in. About 15 minutes of walking, I noticed the most disgusting smell I had ever experienced in my life, and didn't notice it when we went in, so I knew that we were going in the wrong direction. I told my friend Mark that this seemed strange, and that we needed to turn back around and go back the way we came. He hesitated, but eventually agreed with me, so we went back. Then, we started hearing noises, and we got scared shitless. Everybody was hearing scratches on the wall and footsteps. One of our friends said that he saw someone behind us, but I think he was just paranoid and that his mind was playing tricks on him. Eventually, we came to the part of the tunnels that we were familiar with, but we couldn't find any of our marks. After about 1.5 more hours in the tunnels, we found the exit and went out. Now, I know this doesn't seem scary, but let me explain. That next week, I was with my parents in our living room watching the news on the TV, when I heard that the local cemetery sunk in the ground because some of the underground tunnels broke. And then it hit me. The smell I noticed while we were down there. We were under the cemetery. I can't really explain how our marks managed to disappear from the walls, but there was no one in the tunnels except us. After that experience, I started to believe in all the stories that I heard about the tunnels, and I swore that I would never go near those tunnels ever again.
This happened when I was at primary school. My school was a bit strange. There was an underground tunnel or passageway connecting different parts of the gym, the lower part to the higher part. Halfway along this passageway was a small room. I used to belong to a school choir, and I used to call that room the dressing room. I used to use it to store my bag of my personal things when I went to practice. I used to think of it as a green room, you know, like before I went out on stage, like I was a star. I was a kid. Around the summer holiday period, the gym was set to be remodeled. I didn't like it, but I couldn't do much about it, I guess. I was thinking about losing my beloved dressing room, walking home after school, when something dawned on me. I was pretty sure that I had left behind one of my stuffed animals in that room. I had to go and get it. There was no way I was just going to leave it there. I hated the idea of it being crushed under all that rubble. So, even though school had finished, and I was on my way home, I had to turn back. I headed over to the janitor's office, and I asked if I could still get in, and he said, "Oh, don't worry, Mr. K is still in the gym. Go ahead, but hurry up." So I headed over to the gym, walked in, and I couldn't see Mr. K anywhere. I wanted to let Mr. K know I was here. He was a pretty strict teacher, so I knew that if he saw me down here, without me announcing myself, he would be annoyed, and I might be in trouble. Plus, I didn't want to be locked in all night. So I started looking for him, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I guessed that he must have been in the gym's bathroom or something, but when I knocked the door, I got no reply. I felt that time was ticking, so I headed over to my dressing room to get my stuffed animal and get out. I decided to run down through the tunnel and into the dressing room, grab my stuffed animal, and get out. The whole process should take about 30 seconds. I started heading down the tunnel as quickly as I could. Walking down that gloomy tunnel was pretty weird when school wasn't in session. Then, I smelt something terrible. There was a gaping hole in the ground, ahead in the tunnel. I remembered that there was a manhole in the middle of the tunnel, close to the dressing room, and it was open. I thought that there might be a person down there. Did they already start the construction work? Or was that Mr. K down there? I didn't want to know, to be honest. Either way, I thought I would be in trouble. I decided to sneak by without causing a scene. I got past the manhole and I heard some sounds behind me. I really didn't like it, so with fear likely painted on my face, I hurriedly got into the dressing room, but I held the door slightly open and watched to see if someone would emerge. I saw a flashlight flicking around at the end of the tunnel, then Mr. K. He had a big duffel bag with him. He was carrying it over his shoulder. I was curious as to what he was doing and what he was holding.
It was weird. Whatever it was heavy. He was struggling and grunting as he fumbled with the bag. He threw it down there. He threw it down the manhole, and it landed with a heavy thud. He then tried to shut the manhole. He seemed desperate. I thought that since he was struggling, I could announce myself and offer to help him. I took one step out of the dressing room, and he froze and spun his head around and stared at me. "Who's there?" he shouted. This really freaked me out. Remember, I was in elementary school. It was so jarring to have a teacher shout at me in the dark tunnel after school. He stood there glaring in my direction. I didn't know what to do, but he looked so mad. I just ran for it. I was terrified I would hear his footfall echo up the tunnel behind me, but I didn't. Even though Mr. K wasn't the nicest teacher, I have never heard him shout at a student like that. I was convinced that he mistook me for a thief or an intruder. It was frightening to me. I thought I had upset him. During the summer holidays, I went back to school a couple of times. They used to hold pool events, and it was always fun to see my friends there. The first time I went back, I saw that parts of the gym were in the process of being demolished. By the time the following week had rolled around, half the gym lay in ruin. It was odd to see it like that. It was the second or maybe third time I came back to school on one of those pool days, and I noticed that the gym was now completely destroyed. I noticed something else at this point too. There were police cars in the parking lot. I watched the police officers leave their car to be greeted by the principal and the janitor. They walked in the direction of where the tunnel and my dressing room used to be, and that's all I saw. Mr. K never came back after the summer break, and there was a small Buddhist altar set up in the new building, which sat on the land the gym was on. Even though I didn't understand at the time, I knew that something was wrong. Something happened with Mr. K in that duffel bag, and I am just glad that I ran when I did.
Near Central California, there's an old mining community that you've probably never heard of, called the Motherlode. It's an area of California that was a large part of the gold rush. That is where this story takes place. On the way out of town, down a long road almost like a stretch of highway, you suddenly veer off to the right and go down a rough, older road, less than a quarter mile down. The road dead ends into a circle parking area with a gate at the end, which is kept locked by the city. If you were to go past the gate, you would end up at a popular lake in my area. When you park at the end, you are basically surrounded on one side by steep hills dotted with poison oak and tall pine and oak trees. The other side is a steep downhill slope to the lake. So basically, you are in a bowl. We were told that if we were to go up to the left, up the steep hill, that there would be an old mine, long abandoned by the miners that the county didn't close. About 250 feet up the steep hill, we found the old mine, almost hidden in a slight divot in the hillside that you wouldn't see unless you walked right up on it. To get into the mine, you had to climb down a slight slope into the ground and go over some medium-sized rocks on the ground, leftovers from when they blasted into the mountain. The mine itself was about 7 feet tall and 6 feet wide, which formed a tunnel that was about 250 feet into the mountain. The mine had rough rock walls with a colorful vein running through the left wall. This vein is said to indicate the presence of gold by its ribbons of colors. The tunnel followed along that vein, taking at least 2 turns with a couple of short, dead-ended offshoots. As you got deeper into the mine, you had to step carefully to avoid mud, which is what the old ore cart tracks were handy for. Ore carts hauled blasted rocks out of the mine on like mini railroad tracks. Once you were inside the mine, it was completely and utterly dark and silent, except for the sounds of the wind howling and dripping water. We took our time walking down the dark tunnel until we eventually reached the tunnel's end, a wall of solid rock. Disappointed, we started on the way back to the entrance. My buddy decided to stop near the entrance to chip some sample rock from the vein in the wall. He promised to be quick, so I just stood and waited for him. I maybe stood there for a couple of minutes before I heard the first strange sound. It sounded like a small pile of rocks toppling over, echoing up the shaft towards us. I tried to tell my buddy what I just heard, but he didn't hear me, so I just let it go. Not even 2 minutes later, I heard it again, and this time, closer. That time I got his attention to tell him what I just heard, but he just thought I was being paranoid. He said, "You're just hearing an echo from me." I tried to take his word for it, but again, not even 2 minutes later, there it was again. That time the sound came with a feeling of panic and fear. That was when I literally just said, "You only have to be faster than your slowest friend." Then I just took off running, over the rocks and out of the mine. When he came out a few minutes later, he said he walked back to the end and didn't see any fallen rocks. I didn't go back there until a few years later with another buddy of mine. Same as before, up the steep hill we went. The mine looked exactly as it did before, front to back, with no signs of a cave-in. Just as my other buddy had done before. This friend just had to stop on the way out to chip away at that damn vein, winding along the left wall. As I was standing there waiting, I heard another strange, scary sound. But that time, it sounded like a rattle, and we both heard it. The only way we could describe it was it sounded just like a baby rattle. We both froze and looked at each other, puzzled and anxious, illuminated in each other's headlamps. Not even a couple of minutes later, we both heard it again. The sound of a baby rattle. We both grew up here, so we knew it wasn't a rattlesnake or anything, which are common here. When we heard it the third time, the creepy feeling came right back to me, and I just ran out of there as fast as I could, practically tripping on the rocks on the way out. I haven't gone back since. I can't describe it. Something about that old mine just came with a bad, scary feeling, and both people that went there with me felt it as well.
I used to work in Kipapa Gulch, Oahu, Hawaii. Some years ago I worked for a solar firm as a warehouse manager. I was in charge of their warehouse, which was located at the Kipapa Caves. The warehouse was 2 rented caves and the surrounding lots which were fenced in. These caves were old military storage units dug into the gulch walls. The caves were about 200 foot deep and 20 foot wide and tall, reinforced with concrete. The solar firm stored their equipment and their materials in the cave. The lots were where vehicles, heavy machinery, and a few 40-foot containers were held. I worked there with my driver. The caves had no electricity or plumbing, so a solar system and a backup generator powered the caves, and a porta-potty provided relief. Cell reception was spotty at best, so I would have to drive out to make cell phone calls. I started working there and I had no information on the history of Kipapa Gulch. My work schedule was 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. When I started work, a lot of times it was still dark when I got there. I had to power up the caves. If the batteries on the solar system didn't have enough juice, I'd have to power the generator. I'd normally have to do this using only the light from my phone. It was pretty quiet at our units. The neighboring caves were quite a distance away, and they were primarily used as storage, so we didn't really see anybody around. Rarely a truck would pass by going up to the units further up the gulch. At first it was like any other workplace, nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after I started to notice some weird happenings. The first thing I noticed that was weird was the dead animals. Walking around the site, I would find dead jacks and chameleons all over the place. They were just there on the ground dead. I figured cats were getting them, but I also noticed that their carcasses were intact without damage. Looks like they just fell off from trees around the cave. There were a lot of dead mongoose, mynah birds, owls, pigeons and ducks, all intact carcasses, with no predatory marks like bites or scratches. Pretty weird, yeah? Now on to the really weird stuff. Every few days or so I would hear banging coming from inside the containers. The containers were under lock and key. Every time I would hear banging, I would have to unlock and open the containers to make sure nobody was inside. I would open the containers and find nobody or any animals inside. After a few weeks of this, I said fuck it and stopped checking. I figured that the materials inside were adjusting to the temperature changes. While working in the cave one day, walking to the back end, passing a certain spot, I smelled the strong scent of body odor. It was like I passed by very close to someone, but there was no one in the cave that day but me. I walked to the back of the cave, did what I needed to do back there, and proceeded to walk back to the front of the cave. As soon as I got to the spot where I smelled the BO, I smelled again the strong odor, just as before. It seemed like I just passed by very close to someone. I got to the entrance of the cave and quickly checked if I forgot to put deodorant on during my morning routine, but no, I did have my deodorant on. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I had a small desk set up at the entrance of the cave where I work on a laptop. I would check emails from the office and do paperwork. Every so often I would hear noises coming from the back of the caves. Noises were like something moving, and it sounded like something large, bigger than a mongoose or a cat. At first I would go back to check it out, but after a few times of finding nothing there, I said fuck it. I chalked it up to the equipment, adjusting to temperature changes. One early morning while it was dark, before my driver left on his route, we heard a woman screaming, coming from above the caves. The gulch walls were about 100 foot up, and the sounds came from the top. It sounded like domestics, and went on for about 15 minutes. My driver and I figured that there was a subdivision up there and a couple were just having it out. A few weeks later, during a lull in work, my driver and I decided to drive up the gulch to check out other caves. We drove about a mile up the gulch and came to the last cave. From there we could see our cave and what was directly above it. To our amazement, on the plateau above the cave, there was no subdivision, no houses, no roads, no nothing. Who was screaming up there? What the fuck? Who was up there screaming? We had a lot of machinery, vehicles, electronics, mechanical equipment, solar systems, etc. Everything would seem to crap out, even our personal vehicles and property. We would have to call the technicians to come and repair the equipment and machinery. They were constantly there repairing stuff, but what was weird was a lot of the times they would come down and find nothing wrong with the equipment, where all of a sudden the equipment started to work fine. After a while of this, we started to video ourselves, starting up the equipment, so that we could show them we were doing it correctly, and the equipment was in fact not working before we called for a repair. But this is the creepiest thing that happened to me there. One day I loaded my driver up, and he left for his route. I then had to go do my business. I went to the porta potty and locked the door. Before I could do anything, the stall began to shake back and forth. I yelled out, thinking that my driver came back and was playing a joke on me. I unlocked the door, hopped out, thinking I would find my driver laughing, but no one was there. I ran up to the cave to see if anyone was around. Again, nobody there. I called my driver. The call went through, and he was already on the freeway. He thought I was crazy after I told him what happened. After that, I tried not to use the porta potty as much as I could. After a year there, I was laid off due to a slump in the solar business. Only then, I decided to seek out the history of that place. Why don't you look up the history of Old Hawaii Kipapa Gulch and let me know what you think. By the way, one of the caves across from where our caves were is where the illegal fireworks disposal crew lost their lives. It is said that a crew member was smoking in the cave where they stored seized illegal fireworks.
This happened about 2 years back. It all started when I went on a solo mountain climbing trip in Tohoku. I started my climb at roughly 8 a.m. I made it to the summit of the mountain by 12 p.m. It only took about half the time I went up to get back down, so I was left with some free time on my hands. I I decided to take in the scenery. I headed down a road around the cliff face. It was a refreshing change from the mountain trail I had spent the morning on. I had read online that a lot of people pick their own vegetables in this area, so I thought I'd give that a shot, take a wee keepsake back home with me. So I was foraging around deep into the cliff face forest, getting some good stuff and enjoying the scenery. I found plenty of wild mushrooms and lots of interesting plants. Then, up ahead, I saw a dark black shadow about 30 meters away. I got closer and realized it was an entrance to a cave. I was curious, so I stumbled through the bushes towards it. On closer inspection, it was incredibly dark, but plenty wide for entering. I had my mountain hiking headlamp with me, and I had been caving a couple of times, so I thought, why not? It's pretty cool discovering a cave. Here in Japan, if you discover one, you get to name it. And if a new large cave was discovered, it would be on the national news. So with those thoughts on my mind, I went in. I didn't want to tell anyone about it since I didn't want anyone to claim it for their own. I really felt as if this was an undiscovered cave. I had to check it myself. The cave floor was rough and ragged and littered with puddles. It was big and surprisingly wide. It opened out into different areas. It was big enough to stand up in too. So I wouldn't get lost, I dropped some of my vegetables as makeshift markers, Hansel and Gretel style, in the hope I would easily be able to find my way back to the entrance. After about 20 minutes of walking around in there, I met a dead end. Well, not a dead end actually. There was a hole, 2 meters wide, enough to squeeze my body through. I was sure I could get through there easily and continue exploring the cave. I didn't have the courage to enter the hole. Fears of claustrophobia and the idea of being trapped alone in the dark there were insurmountable. Instead, I shone my torch inside. I saw that after about 1 meter or so, it opened out again. I could see stalagmites on the cave floor. I panned along the ground with my headlamp and saw something humanoid in shape. I'll never forget the moment my eyes landed on it. It looked like a mound of hardened mud at first, but it wasn't. It was a humanoid shape on the cave floor. It had long limbs, dark, hardened mud-like skin, and tiny eyes. The eyes, they looked useless. It was thin and looked as if it was bigger than a human. It was only partially visible, but the second I saw it, I let out an involuntary scream. I was just laying there motionless between the stalagmites. I turned my head away almost instantly, and as if in response, I heard something groan from that chamber. It didn't sound normal. It was like some inhuman grunt. Things weren't normal in the cave and I had to get out. I needed to be out. I ran for it. Some innate instinct told me to flee, and as I did, I barely kept myself stable. I weaved in and out of the puddles and around rocks. I heard the flutter of bats behind me as I ran. Behind the flapping of wings was a definite inhuman groan I had heard moments ago, except this time I heard footfall. It sounded like someone or something was running. I tripped and skinned my knees. I got to my feet as soon as I could and kept running. I saw the light of the exit of the cave up ahead as the bats flew past me overhead. The sun was setting when I got out. I kept running towards the ridge and climbed down. It was 7:30 when I arrived at the parking lot below. Thankfully, there were some people around. I asked them for help. My leg was in agony from my trip in the cave. My knees were covered in blood. An older gentleman drove me to the nearest hospital, and I was immensely grateful. The wounds on my legs were deeper than I realized. The man who drove me to the hospital stayed with me until midnight and invited me to join his caving club meeting, so I did. I told them what I had seen in the cave, and they theorized the following. The growling sound I heard was probably made by the echo of the bat wings. They told me that seeing humanoid-shaped masses in caves is entirely normal. It is a conditioned response to the darkness for humans to find shapes which the mind can easily recognize. They were all interested in checking the cave out, and so was I, since I might be attaching my name to it. A few days later, I was invited to go back to the cave with the group to check it out. My injuries hadn't healed, so I declined. I heard from the group that they went in search of the cave but weren't able to locate it. After several failed expeditions, they called me again to double-check the location. Eventually, they managed to persuade me to come back and show them the way to the cave myself. I couldn't believe they couldn't find it, and I started to wonder if I had hallucinated the whole thing. I quickly understood when I got there the reason why this bunch of caving enthusiasts couldn't find the cave. It turned out they weren't the best map readers. The thicket outside was more overgrown now. It gave me the chills to be back there. I could see that thing in my mind's eye. We all stood in front of it, and there were about 10 of the caving club members in attendance. I still believed I saw something humanoid on the cave floor. There was an atmosphere outside the cave which was unexplainable. The leader of the caving club said, "Come on, you look into the chamber, and it'll be nothing but a disappointment. Trust me, we are going to light the place up for you too," he said as he tapped his torch. Everyone was armed with a torch, and that made me a bit less anxious to go in. Plus, I realized I'd look pretty dumb if I didn't go in. I mean, what would I do? Just sit outside waiting for them? Once inside, thanks to the torches, the whole cave was illuminated. It didn't seem as daunting anymore. I could see more of the cave now. I was surprised to see less rocks and debris on the ground, and equally surprised to learn that the cave ascended and descended in areas. All 10 of us went in, and sadly I couldn't see any trace of the humanoid creature I saw. It took us about 30 minutes to scour the entire cave and reach the point where I saw it. One of the caving club guys wasted no time and attempted to climb through. He said that there was about a 4-meter drop the other side of the opening, so it's just as well that something scared me off. If I might have been braver, I might have fallen and been trapped in the darkness alone. One thing I noticed was that the stalagmites had been broken as if some path had been created. I looked totally mad to the caving club members. I felt a bit foolish. It all seemed so real. They seemed happy enough. They wanted to come back with climbing gear and explore the place where I saw the humanoid creature. I didn't want to be part of that. I mentioned that my Hansel and Gretel wild vegetable trail was nowhere to be seen, but I guess some animal could have gotten them. A few weeks pass, and someone from the caving club calls. They investigated the other chamber. They said they found a pile of strange things in there. Climbing gear, watches, bones, clothes, and a pile of vegetables, which had begun to rot. Something was in there. Probably still is. I don't ever want to go back.
Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.